We're looking at the wisdom practice at the moment. Wisdom in Sanskrit is prajna. Another word similar to that is in Sanskrit vipassana, or in Pali vipassana, normally translated as insight. So this is the wisdom practice, and in all Buddhist traditions it's acknowledged that the underlying cause of our mental afflictions and suffering is our fundamental ignorance. So therefore, to overcome mental afflictions and suffering, we need to develop wisdom, the wisdom understanding reality. In the Theravada traditions, it's acknowledged that the fundamental ignorance we suffer from is we grasp onto self. We grasp onto existing in a self-sufficient, substantially existent way. And so if we can come to realize, know self, that we do not exist in this way, we can overcome all mental afflictions and suffering. In the Mahayana traditions, of course they acknowledge we need to realize no self. But in the Mahayana traditions, it's understood that there's a deeper level of ignorance operating than just this ignorance, the ignorance of grasping to self. And this is what the Buddha taught in what's called the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. Here he taught the idea that at this level, in the Theravada level, how we see the world is not a problem. There is an objective world there. The only problem is really how we see ourselves as a person. We overinflate the sense of me. We grasp onto self. That's the problem. In the Mahayana, and based on the Perfection of Wisdom teachings from the Buddha, it's understood that actually how we see the world is deceiving us. The world is not existing in the way it appears to us. That in fact there is no independent objective world there. There is no independent objective me, subjective me here. And so this is the idea of emptiness. The emptiness meaning that everything's empty of existing independently. So here, of course, we're talking about grasping onto independent existence. And that word, independent existence, there's a number of terms in the text used to describe that. Probably the most common term you see is the word inherent existence. Inherent existence has the idea that things are self-existent. They have their own unique identity. They exist within themselves. That the world is made up of many separate, discrete, unique things. There's another term you often see, existing from its own side. So this has the idea that things exist from their own side, meaning they do not require any observer for them to exist. They simply exist from their own side already. And another term you often see is true existence. Now, the word true, something is true if it doesn't deceive us. Things appear to exist independent of us. If they really exist in that way, they would be true. Meaning the way in which they appear and the way in which they exist match. So true existence means existing in the same way in which it appears. So all of those three terms are describing the same thing, independent existence. They're describing it from a slightly different perspective. So that's some terms we see. So of course here what we're saying is that things are not existing like this. So the reasoning is things are empty of inherent existence, or in other words, things are not independently existent because they are dependent arisings. The word dependent arising here means the word arising means coming into existence. So things come into existence dependently. So things are not independently existent because they are dependently existent. So this phrase here, empty of inherent existence, is emptiness. So emptiness is the fact that things are empty of inherent existence, or in other words, they're not independently existent. So emptiness is not saying nothing really exists. Emptiness is simply saying nothing is existing independently, because everything is dependently existent. So if we can understand what do we mean by things existing dependently, then we can better understand what emptiness is, because these are like two sides of a coin. So what I'd like to do now is have a look at what does it mean for things to be dependent arisings, that they come into existence dependently. Things exist depending on causes and conditions. For example, this laptop, one of the first conditions necessary for it to exist is someone needed to think about designing it. And then, of course, all the raw materials needed to be gathered. Those raw materials needed to be refined, all the various components needed to be manufactured, and then all those components needed to be assembled. And then, of course, all the factories and people involved in the process also necessary. So all of those causes and conditions were necessary for us to have the laptop here today. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. But also, things exist depending on their parts. Again, this laptop here exists depending on its parts. Without the metal frame, the keyboard, the keys, the screen, the electronic components, without all these parts, there would be no laptop. So again, fairly straightforward, that everything exists depending on their parts. But remember, this reasoning should be overturning the idea that things exist independently. However, I think most of us can quite happily accept that this laptop depends on causes and conditions, it depends on its parts, and yet at the same time we're also happy to accept that when we walk in that door there's already a laptop sitting here on the table. True? That shouldn't be possible, according to this reasoning. Why doesn't this seem to have any effect then?
Could you repeat the contradiction?
Yeah. We're happy to accept that this laptop exists depending on cause and conditions. it exists depending on its parts, and at the same time we're happy to accept the fact that there's a laptop sitting here on the table when we walk in the door. Doesn't seem to be a contradiction.
The causes and the conditions and the parts still are still maintained when we walk twice.
Do you see a contradiction or not? No.
No.
That's right. That's what I'm saying. But according to this reasoning, there should be a contradiction. So why doesn't there seem to be a contradiction from our side? And the reason is, we only understand these ideas at a fairly superficial level. To understand them at the deepest level, we have to go to the third way in which things are dependent. That things exist depending on imputation, labelling, conception, designation. These are all the 4 different words for the same thing. So when we look at that, we think, I think I know what that means. It means there's a thing here on the table we're calling a laptop. So again, that's a fairly superficial understanding of what we mean here. To appreciate this at a deeper level, we can understand actually that when we look out on the world, what we receive is just a mass of sense data, particularly visual data. And we have to make some sense or meaning out of all of this stuff. Otherwise we couldn't function. It would be just meaningless. So what we do is we create meaningful things. We draw lines around certain collections of data. We create an object to make meaning out of this. But not only do we draw a line and create objects, we have to give them names, because we don't live in isolation, we live with others. So to communicate, we have to give names to these things we've created so we can communicate. So this third point is that process. It's the process of drawing lines to create objects, and then on top of that to give a name. So that's what it means. Now, how we divide up the world is not fixed. It's completely arbitrary, depending on the meaning that we want to get out of the world. For example, how many objects are here? How many things are here? One. We could say there's one star. We could also say there's 2 triangles. We could say there's 6 triangles. We could say there's 6 triangles and a hexagon. Or we could say there's a collection of 18 lines. So is there 1, 2, 6, 7 or 18 things here? We decide. There's no star existing here from its own side. We bring a star into existence by drawing a single line around all of this data and creating that object. We bring it into existence. There's not a star there from its own side, independent of our conceptual framework. And we are constantly improving our ability to draw lines and give names. A young baby has very limited capacity to do that. And even now, when we find ourselves in a new situation we've never seen before, we often, like scratching our heads, goes, what's that? We don't know if it's a single thing, a collection of things, we've got no idea. So we're confused. So we are trying to, based on our memory and concepts, we're trying to make some sense or meaning. We don't know where to draw the line, so we are struggling to find meaning. So that's what we're doing. So therefore, what we can say is that things are not findable. you will not find a star there from its own side, because we bring the star into existence through our conceptual framework. And therefore the star is what's called merely labelled. Merely means just or only. So something is merely labelled, meaning it only exists within our conceptual framework. It does not exist from its own side. There is no star to be found there amongst the bases from its own side. It only exists within our conceptual framework. So this is what this third point means. So based on this understanding, let's go back and look at these two ideas again. So this is a timeline, this is a seed, and this is the plant that it produces. So we say the plant exists depending on causes and conditions. The underlying cause is the seed, the conditions are the soil, sunlight, and water, and so forth. Now, we believe things exist independently. If they exist independently, if they exist from their own side, then there should be a fixed, obvious point where the seed becomes the plant. So, in this timeline, where does the seed become the plant?
Sorry, can you repeat yourself? I didn't understand why there's supposed to be a certain point where the seed becomes a plant in order for it to be...
So we say that the plant exists depending on causes and conditions. The underlying cause is the seed. So the seed becomes the plant. The question is, at what point does the seed actually become the plant?
Depends.
Depends on what?
Depends on also the third part. Because only when we say there's a plant there, there's a tree there, there's a tree.
Right, but...
Well, I can say that when it becomes a plant, when it rises from the ground, I can say that.
When is it?
Right, but remember, we believe or grasp onto things existing independent of us, independent of our conceptual framework. If that's the case, then it shouldn't depend on our conceptual framework when the seed becomes the plant, because they exist independent of us. They exist from their own side. So where is that point where the seed becomes the plant? The point that's independent of our conceptual framework. It doesn't exist.
Why do I need it? Sorry, I don't get this one then.
Okay.
Like, I don't get why I need to get it in order
Okay.
to... Yes.
So where does the seed become the plant?
I don't know.
Why not?
Well, because if we rely on the third option...
No, we're not.
We're not. We're thinking only about causes and conditions now.
Correct, in the way that we normally understand them.
Okay.
So
So the cause is the seed and the condition is
the soil, sunlight, water, and so forth. So
and the result is the plant.
right.
Okay.
So at what point does the seed become the plant? That's the question.
But why do I need to know that in order to understand the first one? I can just see that from the cause to the conditions to the result, I can see that the conditions is that I have the seed. The causes are the soil, the
No,
ground,
the cause is the
everything.
seed.
Sorry, the cause is the seed, the conditions is the soil, the ground, everything else. And the result is the plant. I just see this is how it is. Why do I need a certain specific point to understand when the cause would becoming a result?
Because we have the idea of cause and result, so therefore the cause transforms into the result. So I want to know at what point does the cause become the result?
But why the fact that I don't know it is showing that it's not true? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Because what we can understand when we look at this is the point at where the seed becomes the plant is the point where this configuration of data stops looking like our concept of seed and starts looking like our concept of plant. So we decide when the seed becomes the plant. But if things exist independent of our conceptual framework...
There's no seed, there's no plant, because they may be the same thing and maybe not. It's our decision calling it a seed or a plant.
Correct. So we determine that. We decide when the plant comes into existence, which is contrary to the way we see things. Because we believe things exist independent of our conceptual framework. But by looking at this example, we can understand that that instinctive way of seeing things is false. Because we bring the plant into existence through our conceptual framework. Another question here. The seed and the plant are in a cause and effect relationship. And by definition, if two things are in a cause and effect relationship, they cannot exist at the same time, by definition. Okay? The question is...
Sorry, why not?
Well, that's how we define cause and result. If two things are in a cause and result relationship, that is how we define it. If they're in a cause and effect relationship, they cannot be simultaneously existing. That's the meaning of cause and result. Because if they exist at the same time, then they're not in a cause and result relationship. Because they exist at the same time.
Yeah, but if I take the computer for instance, okay, and the result, the causes was that a lot of I don't know, electricity and everything else created the computer. It still is.
They're conditions. They're conditions.
Okay.
So we have to distinguish between cause and conditions. We need a lot of conditions like soil, sunlight, and water for the plant to exist, and of course they exist at the same time as the plant.
Yeah.
But the cause is the seed. Does the seed exist at the time of the plant? No. By definition, it can't. Otherwise, they're not in a cause and effect relationship. So the question is now, does the seed stop existing before the plant comes into existence? So don't think about it. Does the seed stop existing before the plant comes into existence? There can only be two answers, yes or no. Which is it? Yes or no?
No.
No, that would imply they exist at the same time, which is illogical because they're in a cause and effect relationship. So no is illogical.
Right.
If you say yes, the seed has ceased to exist, where is the plant coming from? Yes is illogical. Both no and yes are illogical, which means that reasoning shows that if we believe that things exist independently, cause and effect becomes illogical. It cannot function. It's illogical. Great Indian master Nagarjuna in the 2nd century wrote a classic text called Mula Madhyamika Karika, the fundamental wisdom of the middle way. And he has 27 chapters of these arguments. He says, you believe in independent existence? What about cause and result? How does that work? Agent and action, how does that work? Fire and fuel, how does that work? And he goes through every one of these logically, and we go, oh, they can't work. They don't. It's impossible. So what we're saying is that the assumption that things exist independently is wrong. It's invalid. So these sorts of arguments can help to break down that. Of course, if we understand that things are merely labelled, we don't have this fallacy because we're simply changing the label. So this can help us to appreciate that things exist only within the conceptual framework. Yeah?
Can't you say that the seed is inside the plant or the fuel is inside the fire?
You can say that, but you can say that, but then you can't say that the seed and the plant are in a cause and effect relationship. Yeah, sure, you can say that, but then our idea of cause and effect does not apply to seed and plant.
There's some connectedness between life and death, like there is something that's going on. Maybe it's only I thought about life and death.
Yeah, I'm going to answer that later in the session.
Okay. With the first one, I still don't entirely get it. For example, if I need something, yeah, and then it becomes a blanket, so, and you're asking me the same question of when did it become a blanket, and I explain, well, when I'm done knitting it. Why is that not a satisfying answer?
Sure. But you decide that.
Well, maybe everybody decides that.
Does it? Really?
For example, yeah.
Really?
If I'll find one thing that everyone in the world agree on, well, that's just,
Well,
just have that
okay.
If I'll find something
Okay,
that
if-
everyone agree on,
Start with
will I
that.
be
Then,
able-
then you found something that everyone agrees on.
Yeah.
That's all. That's it.
Why?
Then we've found something that everyone agrees, that everyone has the same conceptual framework and agrees that it's that thing. That's all. That's all you've done.
Yeah, but maybe
That logic doesn't lead it to the conclusion that it exists independent of us. It just
yeah,
means
but it
everyone
doesn't
has
lead
to.
us- Yeah, but at the same time, you don't have a proof here that it doesn't.
Yes, I do have a problem.
Ah,
For example, cat maybe would look at this differently, right?
Yeah.
No, I'm saying everyone, hypothetically,
not
everyone agrees.
everybody.
Go with me this one, okay? Everyone in the world agrees
We
with me
agree.
on one thing.
Right.
What proof do you have that it's only like
No, it's
our
just
thinking?
It means then-
everyone.
It means then we could never think of it in any other way because it's a blanket.
When did
So you could never, because that's what it is from
Yeah,
its
but
own side.
before it was just thread.
Right, but now you're saying that it's a blanket, okay?
Yes.
And that blanket is a blanket from its own side.
Yes.
So then it can't be anything else because it's a blanket from its own side.
Yes.
So we can't see it as anything else.
No.
We can't see that as anything else?
Well, if we agree that it's a blanket, it's a
But
no, wait.
hang on. The
Wait.
fact that you've said that we agree
Yes.
is already this.
Okay, but now you're going on my
Isn't it?
words.
No, but that's what
Yeah,
you're saying.
you are.
Agree means that we all see it or think of it in the same way. That is conception. Anyway, I've got some more to, and then we can think about it more.
If you understand it,
Okay.
you become a Buddha right now.
Right,
That's why I'm fighting.
okay.
Yeah.
So, we say, another thing to think about. We say that the result depends on the cause. Okay? This view is saying that the cause also depends on the result. How does the cause depend on the result?
It's not a seed if it's
Well,
not
it's-
going to be a plant.
Correct. You can't call this a seed unless you have the idea plant. You can't call something a cause unless you have the idea result. It just makes no sense. Whether or not it produces a result is irrelevant. Okay, another point. But I don't have a good example. Does anyone have a pen that I can pull apart into
Yes.
bits? I need to be able to pull it apart into bits. Okay. Pen exists depending on its parts. But can we find a pen here anywhere? Oops. Is this a pen? No. Is this a pen? No. Is this a pen? No.
It will never
Is
be a
this a pen? No. Is this a pen? No. Is this plastic tube, just a plastic tube, is that a pen? Is the ink inside, is that a pen? Is the round ball on the end a pen? Is the other piece of metal a pen? Where's the pen? And people go, oh, that's easy. It's the collection of all of that. There's the collection. Is that a pen? Oh, no. It has to be in a certain shape. Okay. So you have to tell me when the pen comes into existence. I don't know if I'll manage to do this, actually. No, not yet. No. Now?
That was a pen.
Oh. So from this example, what we can understand is that we bring the pen into existence. The pen comes into existence when this configuration of data closely enough resembles our concept of pen. And our concepts often have at least two parts, appearance and functionality. So when this appears closely enough to our concept of pen and it seems to function according to our idea of pen, then there's a pen, not before. If this pen existed from its own side, independent of our conceptual framework, it would mean that if a caveman came in the door, they'd see a pen and they'd start writing with it. If a dog came in the door, I think they would see, maybe, they wouldn't see a pen, they'd maybe see some, so the caveman maybe actually instead of pen, they'd see maybe some sort of weapon to stab things with. And if a dog came in the door, maybe they'd see some sort of chewing stick to chew on. And if a tiny ant came here, they may see some sort of home to live in. So is this a pen, a weapon, a chewing stick, or a home? It's none of those from its own side, and it's all of those from the side of the observer. So this pen exists dependent on the conceptual framework. So here we can understand something. Normally, we say the pen is the collection of the parts. But what we're saying here is the pen exists depending on the collection of the parts. If we can understand those two statements are not saying the same thing, we're starting to understand something about emptiness. So again, the two statements are the pen is the collection of the parts versus the pen is merely labelled depending on the collection of parts. And again here, the pen depends on the parts, meaning the whole depends on the parts. But like earlier, this view is also saying the part depends on the whole. Again, you can't call something a part of a pen without the idea pen. So the part depends on the whole as well. Now, we need to draw these lines and create objects. Otherwise, we couldn't function. So there's nothing wrong with drawing a line and giving the name pen. We have to do that. Otherwise, no meaning, we wouldn't be able to function. The problem is we don't realize that's what we're doing. The problem is that it seems like things are existing from their own side. It seems like the world is already divided up into many separate, discrete things. So we've turned our lines that we draw into boundaries, hard boundaries. But then you may ask, well, what's the problem with seeing the world as made up of many separate, discrete things? What's the big deal? What's the problem with that? The problem is what we looked at earlier in this suffering and its causes chart. Because if we see everything as separate, discrete things, this is ignorance, and then we experience something as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, then we're going to, based on that, we're going to see it as inherently attractive or inherently unattractive, attachment, aversion, big mess. Whereas if we understand the world is not made up of many separate, discrete things, the world is a product of our mind, things exist only within our conceptual framework, then when we experience things, particularly if we experience something attractive, we will experientially know we are creating the beauty in our conceptual framework. So beauty is in the eye of the beholder. We can simply enjoy that pleasant experience without craving and attachment. And we can see the unpleasant experience without aversion. So we will not have any mental afflictions.
I think I have this sort of confusion between renunciation and interdependence. Because in renunciation we say, I am not my body. We create a separate...
Renunciation?
Renunciation.
No, I think you're talking about something else.
Well,
Renunciation is simply the wish for liberation from suffering. That's all.
well, let's say when you talked about cognitive fusion.
Cognitive fusion. Yeah.
This is stuff when we put stuff together,
Right.
like the pen. We
Yeah.
we glue it together in our minds.
Right.
And the second thing is we're trying to say that stuff are connected somehow.
Correct.
We're trying to at the
Correct.
same time say that stuff are not connected.
No. We're saying that they're not the same. They're not fused. So actually, this is a very good point here, and this is a good example. We do cognitive fusion now. We have the basis, this basis here. We have the label pen, yes? And we apply the label pen to the basis. Correct.
Okay.
Just like we have a person, we have a behavior, and the person is doing the behavior. Yes? But we do cognitive fusion, bad person. Here, we do cognitive fusion. We have the basis, we have the label. These are not the same thing, just like the person and behavior are not the same thing. But what we do is we fuse the two together and we say, this is a pen. Correctly, we should be saying pen is something we're labeling to the basis. So there's the basis and the thing, the label.
Okay.
Cognitive fusion is saying this is a pen.
So
And then we get into trouble. Then it seems like it's a separate, independent thing. So cognitive fusion here leads to or reinforces the idea that there is a pen there existing from its own side, because the label we've cemented to that basis. So we see that as a single pen. That's the problem.
there's something similar between this fusion and interdependence. I think they're fighting against each other somehow.
No. Fusion is based on the idea that things are independent, or fusion leads to a belief in independence. Because this is a pen, that the pen exists from its own side then, if we put the label onto the basis. With interdependence, exactly that. The basis and the pen are interdependent, because this is the basis of labeling, and this is the label, and they are interdependent. Just like person or agent is and action are interdependent. The agent and the action are interdependent. You can't have an agent without an action. You can't have an action without an agent, can you? You can't have a basis of labeling without a label. You can't have a label without a basis of labeling. So they are interdependent. But fusing them makes them one thing. So where's the interdependency? It's gone, because there's no longer two things which are interdependent. Yeah.
Okay. So, I have a few questions. First one is, Vaida Mahayana is the fact that we see the reality wrong leads to the fact that we see ourselves in a cherishing way. Is that
Self-cherishing comes from that, yes.
is self-cherishing comes from false?
Self-grasping, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And the second thing is, if like someone who's enlightened, like a Buddha, who realized emptiness, does he suddenly stop seeing the world with
No.
awareness? Because
if we realize emptiness, then when we see the pen, we will directly realize this pen is only existing in our conceptual framework. There's a pen, but we'll realize this directly, that it's a dependent phenomena. It's not some independent thing, which means that it would be impossible to generate any attachment or aversion to this pen,
because we see what it really is.
because we understand it existing how it really is. Like, I'll bring it in now. I was going to talk about it shortly, but I'll bring it in now to answer your question. This topic of emptiness is very subtle, difficult to understand. So, like the Four Noble Truths, often analogies are given to try and understand. Many analogies given here. The one I particularly like and I find helpful is the analogy of a dream. Now, when we're dreaming, in the dream, there appears to be a dream me here, and there appears to be an independent dream world out there. And then if we experience or see something in the dream that's pleasant or unpleasant, we usually react with attachment, aversion, fear, nightmare, and we react and have a lot of difficulties in our dream. But in the dream, if we suddenly realize we're dreaming, i.e. lucid dream, so we're in the middle of the dream and then suddenly we realize, hang on, this is a dream, then there still will appear to be an independent dream me here, there will still appear to be an independent dream world there, but now because we're lucid, we will directly realize this appearance is deceiving us. That this dream world is not out there, it's a product of our mind. Which means now when we're lucid, if something pleasant or unpleasant appears in our dream, it would become almost impossible to have attachment and aversion. And we would enjoy the dream a hell of a lot more. So similarly, our waking life is like a dream. Now there appears to be a me here, there appears to be an independent world out there. And when we see something pleasant, we have attachment. Unpleasant, aversion. Big mess. But if we become lucid in our waking state by realizing emptiness, there will still appear to be an independent me here, there will still appear to be an independent world there. But because we've realized emptiness, now we're lucid, we'll realize directly these appearances are deceiving us. Things are not existing as they appear, things are a product of our mind, things only exist within our my conceptual framework. Which means now, if we experience something pleasant or unpleasant in our waking life, it would become almost impossible to have attachment or aversion, and we would enjoy our life a hell of a lot more. So that's the analogy that I think can be helpful.
Yeah. And how exactly is the self-cherishing comes from the false view?
Okay, so the false view here is seeing independent me, an independent world. So sometimes this is called self-grasping. So self-grasping here is grasping onto independent me. There's an independent me here, independent world there. So then when we see ourselves as independent, of course, I want to be happy, I want to be free of suffering. And because we're seeing the world as independent of us, it seems like happiness and suffering is coming from there. And so we see ourselves as separate, independent of the world. But then, because we have this false view of independent me, not only do we see ourselves as the independent or separate from the world, then we easily go to seeing ourselves as the center of the world. I'm the most important thing. This is self-cherishing. So we can only see ourselves as the center of the world if we see ourselves as separate from the world.
But you didn't explain why we're not separate from the world.
Well, this is what this is. So I'm still
this
coming.
is the world,